6 families, 6 different countries, 6 completely separate industries, and every single one of them went from being unknown to controlling the modern world within the same 30-year window, specifically between 1860 and 1890. Right as old empires were collapsing and entire continents were being reorganized under new legal frameworks. The question historians never ask out loud is why that timing isn't treated as the central fact of the story. Because when you put every name and every date on the same timeline, the coincidence stops looking like a coincidence, and the dates are closer than you've probably been told. Pull up any standard biography of these families, and the dates line up in a way that nobody in a classroom ever asked you to notice. The Rothschilds were still a regional banking name in 1870, and by 1900 their network ran across multiple continents. Rockefeller incorporates Standard Oil in 1870. Morgan starts reorganizing American railroads in the 1880s. Carnegie controls steel by 1892. Astor's real estate empire in New York is already generational before the Civil War ends. Warburg's banking network in Hamburg connects to the same transatlantic credit lines that Rockefeller and Morgan are drawing on at the same time, from a different continent. That's not a list of individual success stories. When you put the dates side by side, it reads like a single coordinated event, with multiple actors running different parts of it simultaneously. The Bootstrap legend says these men spotted opportunities nobody else saw, moved faster than anyone else could, and outworked their competition. And sure, some of that is probably true. But the official story doesn't explain the timing, because talent and drive existed in the 1830s and 1840s too, and none of these families emerged then. Industrialization was already underway in those decades. Steam power, textile mills, early rail lines, it was all there. So if the formula was just hard work plus the right moment, why didn't it produce the same results 20 years earlier? Something changed specifically between 1860 and 1890 that hadn't existed before, and the change wasn't just technological. Part of it was legal. New incorporation laws gave businesses a structure they'd never had before, and new banking frameworks created credit instruments that didn't exist in the 1840s. Railroad land grants handed over enormous stretches of territory to private companies under new legal titles. Patent protections arrived in a form that let one company lock out competitors across an entire industry. All of these arrived in the same compressed window, and the people who lobbied for those frameworks were often the same people who then built empires on top of them. Part of it was physical. The railroads connected markets that had been completely isolated from each other, and the telegraph let financial coordination happen across continents in real time for the first time in history. Those are genuine shifts. But the question isn't whether the technology was real. It's who controlled the infrastructure that made the technology profitable, because the answer to that question is the same small group of names every time. When you trace where the actual capital came from, specifically the long credit lines that let Rockefeller buy out competitors before those competitors could even organize a response, or the bond financing that let Morgan restructure entire railroad networks within a few years, the money traces back to the same small set of transatlantic banking relationships. Not similar relationships, the same ones. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining by 1880, and his net worth in today's money is estimated somewhere between $300 and $400 billion. The conventional story is that he got there through efficiency and ruthlessness, and both of those things are documented. What the conventional story doesn't account for is where the capital came from to fund the initial refinery acquisitions, because the numbers don't work without a credit base that was already in place before Standard Oil existed as a company. He started out as a bookkeeper. The gap between that and buying out the majority of American oil refining in under a decade isn't filled by hard work and good instincts. It's filled by access to capital that most people in 1865 simply didn't have and couldn't get. The capital didn't appear because the business succeeded. The business succeeded because the capital was already there, and the question of where that capital came from keeps pointing back to the same place, which is what was already in position before any of these men made their first move. To understand what those people were stepping into, you have to look at what the ground actually looked like before they arrived. Between 1811 and 1859, North America absorbed a sequence of shocks that don't get taught together, but absolutely should be. Church bells rang in Boston from the New Madrid earthquakes in 1811 and 1812, among the largest in recorded North American history, and the Mississippi River temporarily reversed its flow. Then in 1815, a volcano called Tambora erupted in Indonesia, and the following year, 1816, became known as the Year Without a Summer. Crops failed across the northeastern United States and Europe. An estimated 200,000 people died from famine-related causes in Europe alone. Entire farming communities in New England packed up and left. The population of Vermont dropped visibly, Land that families had cleared and cultivated for generations sat empty, and the title records on that land became incomplete, disputed, or just gone. Then, in 1859, right at the edge of the window we've been talking about, the Carrington event hit. A solar storm so powerful that it set telegraph wires on fire across the network, and aurora borealis showed up near the equator. The global telegraph system, which by 1859 was the central nervous system of international commerce and finance, didn't just go dark. The equipment across the network was physically destroyed, and rebuilding it required starting the financial coordination infrastructure over from scratch. Rebuilding that kind of infrastructure requires capital. Capital requires credit, and credit requires relationships with the people who control it. By 1860, those relationships were concentrated in a very small number of banking houses on both sides of the Atlantic, the same ones we've already traced the Rockefeller and Morgan credit lines back to. So here's what the sequence actually looks like when you put it on one timeline. Natural disasters depopulate large areas and disrupt land records through the 1810s and 1840s. A geomagnetic event destroys the communication infrastructure in 1859. Then, almost immediately after, new legal frameworks arrive to govern land titles, banking, and incorporation, administered by people who are perfectly positioned to benefit from the disruption that just happened. That's not a theory. Those are documented events in a documented order. The question is whether the people who moved into the vacuum were simply the ones who were ready, or whether being ready was itself something that required preparation. The orphan trains make this specific. Between 1854 and 1929, the Children's Aid Society relocated an estimated 250,000 children from eastern cities out to rural areas across the Midwest and the West. The official story is humanitarian, a response to urban poverty and overcrowded streets. And urban poverty was real. But when you overlay the destination maps of where those children went against the areas that had experienced the worst population disruption in the preceding decades, the overlap is hard to dismiss. When you look at where the trains actually went, something doesn't fit the humanitarian explanation. They went to places that needed people, and the pattern of destinations lines up with repopulation, not expansion. The receiving families in many of those places weren't formally vetted in any documented way. The question the official history never asks is why those places needed people in the first place, because answering that question means describing what happened to the people who were there before. And that part of the record doesn't trail off, it stops. You find genealogical dead ends and census records that begin rather than continue, and then there's nothing before them, which brings you to something else the official history doesn't explain, and it's physical. The physical evidence starts with buildings, and some of those buildings don't fit the timeline they've been assigned. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the one people called the White City, was built in 2 years. That's the official timeline. It covered 690 acres, included 200 buildings, ran its own power grid, its own railway system, its own sewage infrastructure, and a central court of neoclassical architecture that visitors described as unlike anything they'd ever seen in America. The official material was staff, a mixture of cement and fiber, which is a temporary construction material. But the architectural vocabulary on display wasn't temporary, and it wasn't improvised. It arrived fully formed, with specific proportions and a complexity that takes generations to develop, not a construction season. That same style shows up in post offices, customs houses, and federal buildings across the United States. In towns the official record lists as frontier settlements in the 1840s and 1850s. Some of those buildings have basement levels that are now at or near street level, which means either the street got raised around them after construction, or the buildings were put up partially below the original grade. In several documented cases, door frames begin underground, and basement arches that clearly functioned as original ground floor entrances are now buried. The ornamentation at that buried level is richer and more detailed than anything on the street-facing facade, which is the opposite of how builders work when they're cutting costs. Seattle's underground is the clearest documented case. After a fire in 1889, the city rebuilt its streets 1 to 2 stories above the original grade, leaving the original building entrances and storefronts underground. You can still walk through them today. The official explanation is that the grade was deliberately raised to sit above the tidal flats, and that's probably accurate as far as it goes. What it doesn't address is why those underground structures show the kind of construction investment you'd expect from buildings meant to last, not from buildings that were only a few decades old when they got abandoned below a new street level. Every city has its own local explanation for its own anomaly, but when you look at the pattern across multiple cities, the local explanations stop covering it. What the pattern suggests is that some of the infrastructure these families inherited wasn't infrastructure they built. It was infrastructure they found, claimed, and folded into the new legal and financial frameworks they were writing at the same time. And if that's true, the capital question from earlier gets a lot less mysterious, because you don't need the same startup capital to refinance and rebrand an existing system as you do to build one from scratch. The families weren't architects of a new world. They were custodians of one that had already been built, and they wrote the titles to match. Johns Hopkins opened in 1876. The University of Chicago opened in 1890 with Rockefeller money. Carnegie funded over 2,500 libraries across the country. The historians writing the New American Story worked in buildings paid for by the people whose story was being written, and the buried basements, the frontier customs houses, the White City built in 2 years on a swamp. None of that made it into the curriculum that those institutions produced. That curriculum didn't appear by accident. Someone designed it, and the records of how that happened are still sitting in archives, waiting for someone to open the right folder. There's a letter in the Kansas State Historical Society that most researchers walk past without opening. It's 2 pages long, and in it, a school teacher describes with careful and deliberate language why she intends to keep teaching from her original curriculum even after being told explicitly to stop. She doesn't explain what the original curriculum contained. She just says it was accurate. Before the 1890s, American public education was decentralized and locally controlled in a way that's hard to picture now. What got taught in a school in rural Ohio had almost nothing to do with what got taught in Boston or Charleston. There was no national framework, no standardized textbook industry, and no way to make sure a particular version of history reached every child in the country at the same time. By 1910, that had changed completely. The National Education Association had been reorganized. A standardized textbook industry had emerged, dominated by a small number of publishers with close financial ties to the same banking and industrial networks we've been talking about. And the new universities were turning out a professional class of educators trained in a curriculum shaped at the foundational level by the philanthropic institutions these same dynasties had built. The timing isn't coincidental. The consolidation of industrial and financial power that had been building for 3 decades reached a kind of completion in the early 1890s, and the question of what school children should understand about how that consolidation happened became, almost immediately, a question that the people who accomplished it had both the motive and the institutional means to answer. What got standardized was a specific story, the bootstrap story, the self-made man. Rockefellers and Carnegies and Morgans who started from nothing, spotted opportunities nobody else saw, and built their empires through individual genius and hard work. That story went into the textbooks, got repeated in newspapers that were increasingly owned by the same financial networks, and became the default way Americans understood wealth and power for the next century. What it left out is everything we've covered in this video. The transatlantic credit lines that were already in place before Standard Oil existed, the demographic disruptions, and the orphan trains, the architectural anomalies, and the questions about what infrastructure these families actually found versus what they built. The synchronized timing across 6 countries and 6 industries makes the self-made story statistically hard to defend. The Pilgrim Society, founded in 1902, shows how the network kept itself organized once the consolidation was done. Its membership overlapped with the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, with the boards of the major banks, with university trustees, and with the senior editorial leadership of the major newspapers. It wasn't a secret society in any dramatic sense. It was a coordination mechanism, a way for the people who'd consolidated power to stay connected and make sure the institutions they controlled kept moving in the same direction. The Bank for International Settlements, founded in 1930, took the transatlantic banking relationships that had been running informally since the 1860s and gave them a permanent institutional form. Its founding members included representatives connected to the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and the Federal Reserve, the same names that trace back through the Rothschild, Warburg, and Morgan networks, now operating through a formal supranational structure that answered to no single government. The curriculum built in the 1890s and early 1900s never asked where the startup capital actually came from. That question wasn't buried dramatically. It just wasn't asked. The textbooks started at the moment of success and worked backward to a flattering origin. And that's where the story started for almost everyone who went to school in this country for the next 100 years. Several of the people who designed that curriculum wrote about what they were doing in private letters that now sit in university archives at universities they funded. Put every name and every date on the same timeline, and what you're looking at is a transfer, not a creation. 6 countries, 6 industries, the same 30-year window. Right after natural disasters cleared population and records from huge areas of land. Right as new legal frameworks arrived to govern what was left. That's not talented people spotting the same opportunity independently. The wealth didn't come from nothing. The infrastructure didn't appear from nothing. Rockefeller's fortune, adjusted for today, sits somewhere between $300 and $400 billion, built inside a window that the official story attributes to a bookkeeper with good instincts. The records that would tell you what existed before 1860 are largely gone, and the institutions that trained the historians who decided that gap wasn't worth investigating were funded by the people who benefited from it. Missing records aren't the same as nothing being there. The official story has never resolved where the startup capital actually came from, because the origin stories these families were given don't fit the numbers, and the people who could have checked those numbers worked in buildings with the family names on them.